By late afternoon, Thornfield Hall had been transformed from a family home into the center of a complex criminal investigation. Police technicians moved methodically through the house, documenting, photographing, and collecting evidence. The hidden chambers beneath the wine cellar had been cordoned off as a crime scene, with specialized art crime investigators called in from Belfast to assist with cataloging the looted collection. In the midst of this controlled chaos, the Kerrigan family members had retreated to separate corners of the house, Margaret in the small drawing room with Mr. Winters, discussing legal implications, Catherine in the library, reviewing documents with grim determination, Robert in the conservatory, a glass of whiskey in hand despite the early hour, and Fiona, notably absent again, presumably giving her formal statement to police. Claire and Sean found themselves in an awkward position, neither family nor officials, but somehow integral to the unfolding drama. They had given their statements about driving Ava home the night before her death and their observations of family dynamics during the investigation. Now they waited in the entrance hall, uncertain whether to leave or remain available as events continued to unfold. "We should probably go," Sean suggested quietly. "The police have what they need from us for now, and our presence might be adding to the family's stress." Claire nodded agreement, though she felt strangely reluctant to leave before all the pieces had fallen into place. "We should check on Margaret Byrne on our way home. If Nolan's interviewing her tomorrow, she should be prepared for the questions he's likely to ask." As they gathered their coats, Margaret Kerrigan emerged from the drawing room, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. Seeing them preparing to depart, she approached with determined strides. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, though her tone suggested she understood their desire to extract themselves from the situation. "We've given our statements to Inspector Nolan," Claire explained, "and we thought your family might appreciate some privacy during this difficult time." Margaret nodded, accepting this reasoning. "You've been extraordinarily helpful, both of you. I won't forget it." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "There is one more thing, if you don't mind, a personal request." "Of course," Sean replied, "if we can help." "Would you check on Margaret Byrne?" Margaret asked, surprising Claire with the unexpected alignment with her own intentions. "She's elderly and lives alone, and given what we now know about her arrangement with James, I'm concerned about how she might be handling these revelations." The request seemed genuinely motivated by concern rather than any ulterior motive, though Claire couldn't help but wonder if Margaret had additional reasons for wanting them to visit her former husband's blackmailer. "We were planning to stop by her cottage on our way home," Claire assured her. "Is there anything specific you'd like us to tell her?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Tell her I don't blame her for the choices James made, and that whatever arrangement they had died with him, she has nothing to fear from me." The message was gracious and seemingly sincere, a remarkable stance given that Margaret had just learned this woman had been blackmailing her husband for decades. "We'll tell her," Sean promised, "and if there's anything else we can do—" "You've done more than enough," Margaret assured them. "Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for your presence during these revelations. It's helpful to have witnesses who aren't entangled in decades of family history." As they said their goodbyes and finally departed Thornfield Hall, Claire felt a curious mixture of relief and lingering concern. The weight of the Kerrigan family secrets had been oppressive, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that significant revelations still remained hidden. "Do you think Margaret's concern for Mrs. Byrne is genuine?" Claire asked as they drove away from the estate. Sean considered the question. "Probably, in part. Margaret Kerrigan strikes me as someone who values propriety and proper behavior, even under extraordinary circumstances. Checking on an elderly neighbor would align with that sense of duty. But she might also be concerned about what Mrs. Byrne might tell the police," Claire suggested. "About her arrangement with James, about what else she might know." "Exactly," Sean agreed. "Though sending us with a message of reassurance is an interesting approach if her goal is to influence Mrs. Byrne's testimony." The drive to Margaret Byrne's cottage took only minutes, the modest home standing in sharp contrast to the grandeur of Thornfield Hall. As they approached the front door, Claire noticed the curtains twitch slightly, Margaret watching for their arrival, as she often seemed to do. The door opened before they could knock, revealing their neighbor in her customary elegant attire, though Claire thought she detected increased strain around her eyes and mouth. "I've been expecting you," Margaret said by way of greeting. "The police have been quite busy at Thornfield today, I understand." "You could say that," Sean replied as they entered the cottage. "It's been an eventful morning." Margaret led them to her sitting room, where tea had already been prepared, another indication she had anticipated their visit. As they settled into chairs, Claire noted that Margaret seemed more fatigued than she had during their previous conversation, the weight of her years more evident in her movements. "I assume the safe deposit box has been opened," Margaret said once they were seated, and James's documentation about the pendant's true origins revealed. "Yes," Claire confirmed, not surprised that Margaret had deduced this much. Along with something unexpected, hidden chambers beneath Thornfield Hall, containing a substantial collection of art and valuables looted during the Holocaust. If Margaret was shocked by this revelation, she concealed it well. Her only reaction was a slight tightening of her grip on her teacup. "Archibald Kerrigan's collection," she said after a moment. "I always suspected there was more to the family fortune than shipping and property investments." "You knew about the looted art?" Sean asked directly. Margaret sipped her tea before answering. "Not specifically, no. James never confirmed the extent of his father's activities during and after the war. But there were rumors in Newcastle for years after Archibald returned from Europe in 1945, suddenly much wealthier than when he'd left, despite the war's disruption to legitimate shipping routes. And you never mentioned these rumors when discussing the pendant's provenance with us?" Claire pressed. "Because they were separate issues, as far as I knew," Margaret replied calmly. "The pendant's theft in 1913 predated the war by decades. I had no concrete evidence connecting it to Nazi looting, though I suspected Archibald had acquired other items through such channels." Claire wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, but she decided to move to more pressing matters. "Margaret Kerrigan asked us to give you a message," she said. "She wants you to know she doesn't blame you for your arrangement with James and that whatever agreement existed between you died with him. She says you have nothing to fear from her." Margaret's expression softened slightly. How very gracious of her, considering the circumstances, though I wonder if she'll maintain that equanimity when she learns the full extent of my relationship with her husband. The phrasing caught Claire's attention. The full extent? There was more than just blackmail over the pendant? A sad smile touched Margaret's lips. "Life is rarely as simple as financial transactions, Mrs. Murphy. James and I had a complex relationship spanning decades. I knew him before he married Margaret. We were briefly engaged, in fact, before his family objected to my comparatively modest background." This revelation added yet another layer to the already complicated history between the Kerrigans and Margaret Byrne. "You were engaged to James Kerrigan?" Claire repeated, surprised. "And then blackmailed him years later when you discovered the pendant's true origins?" "I prefer to think of it as compensation for broken promises," Margaret replied with unexpected candor. "When I recognized the pendant Margaret Kerrigan was wearing as matching one documented in my husband's research on stolen jewelry, I approached James privately. He confirmed my suspicions about its origins and proposed our arrangement, quarterly payments in exchange for my discretion." "But it was more than financial," Sean suggested, reading between the lines of Margaret's careful phrasing. "Indeed," Margaret acknowledged. "Over the years, our relationship evolved. James valued having someone outside the family with whom he could discuss his discoveries about his father's activities, his efforts at restitution, his ethical struggles. I became a confidant of sorts." "Did that include knowledge of the hidden chambers beneath Thornfield?" Claire asked. "Of the looted art collection? James mentioned its existence, but never its specific location or contents," Margaret replied. "He protected me from that knowledge deliberately, I believe, ensuring I couldn't be implicated if the collection was ever discovered." Claire wasn't entirely convinced by Margaret's selective knowledge narrative, but she pressed on to more urgent matters. Did Ava Kerrigan visit you in the weeks before her death? Margaret's expression grew somber. Yes, several times. A bright, troubled young woman searching for truth about her family's past. She'd found some old correspondence between James and me in the Thornfield attic and was full of questions. What did you tell her? The truth about the pendant, that it had been stolen in a jewelry heist in 1913, not commissioned by the Kerrigans as family legend claimed. I didn't know about its connection to Nazi looting at that time, Margaret added, though Claire detected a hint of evasion in her tone. Ava was fascinated, determined to learn more. Did you mention the safe deposit box? Sean asked. Or the pendant's function as a key? No, Margaret replied firmly. I knew nothing about that aspect until you mentioned it during our previous conversation, though Ava herself used that phrase, the key to everything, during our last meeting. I assumed she was speaking metaphorically about how the pendant's true origins might unlock understanding of her family's past. When was this last meeting? Claire asked. 3 days before her death, Margaret said, her expression darkening. She was excited, almost feverish with purpose, said she'd discovered something that would change everything for the Kerrigans, though she wouldn't elaborate further. Did she seem afraid? Sean pressed. Concerned for her safety in any way? Margaret considered the question carefully. Not afraid, precisely, but cautious. She mentioned feeling watched when she visited Thornfield, said she was being careful about what she documented and where she kept her notes. Claire thought of the purple notebook found in the hidden chamber, with its references to the pendant's contradictory history and questions about its function as a key. Did she show you any notes or documentation during your meetings? She had a small notebook she consulted occasionally, Margaret confirmed. Purple, I believe. She guarded it rather zealously, wouldn't let me see its contents directly. This aligned with what they now knew. Ava had been documenting her discoveries about the pendant and family secrets, carefully controlling who had access to that information. Did she mention anyone in the family specifically? Sean asked. Anyone she particularly trusted or distrusted? She spoke warmly of Fiona, Margaret replied, said they were working together on an important project, though she was deliberately vague about its nature. She seemed wary of Catherine, described her as too invested in preserving the status quo. Robert she mainly pitied for his financial mismanagement and dependence on Margaret Sr.'s approval. And Margaret herself, Claire prompted. What was Ava's view of her grandmother? Complex, Margaret answered thoughtfully. Respect mixed with frustration. She believed Margaret Sr. knew more about the family's secrets than she acknowledged, that she had chosen willful ignorance over difficult truths for decades. Claire thought this assessment matched her own observations of the Kerrigan matriarch, a woman of intelligence and perception who had nevertheless maintained certain blind spots when it came to her husband's activities. Mrs. Byrne, Sean said, shifting the conversation, Inspector Nolan will be interviewing you formally tomorrow regarding your connection to the Kerrigans and potentially to Ava's death. You should be prepared for detailed questions about your arrangement with James and your interactions with Ava. Margaret's expression remained composed, though Claire detected a flicker of concern in her eyes. I have nothing to hide from the police, she stated. My meetings with Ava were exactly as I've described them to you, and I was at home alone on the night of her death. The statement was offered without prompting, an alibi volunteered before being requested, which Claire found slightly suspect. The medical examiner places Ava's death between midnight and 3 a.m., she noted. Were you awake during those hours? Might you have seen or heard anything relevant? I take medication that helps me sleep, Margaret replied smoothly. Once I retire around 10, I'm typically undisturbed until morning. So no, I wouldn't have noticed anything unusual during those hours. Before Claire could press further, Margaret abruptly changed the subject. There's something I haven't mentioned yet, something Ava said during our last meeting that struck me as odd at the time, but might be significant given recent revelations. What was it? Sean asked, leaning forward with interest. She asked if I knew anything about tunnels beneath Thornfield Hall, Margaret said. When I said I didn't, she smiled in this secretive way and said, They hold the evidence of everything, all the Kerrigan crimes, past and present. I assumed she was being dramatic, referencing metaphorical skeletons in closets rather than actual hidden chambers. Did she elaborate on what she meant by present crimes? Claire asked, focusing on the curious phrasing. No, Margaret admitted, and I didn't press her. I've learned over the years that people reveal more when allowed to unburden themselves at their own pace. Claire wasn't sure she entirely believed Margaret's account of these conversations with Ava. There was a calculated quality to her revelations, as though she were carefully selecting which details to share and which to withhold. But before she could formulate another question, Sean spoke up. Mrs. Byrne, given your history with the Kerrigans and your conversations with Ava, who do you think might have had reason to kill her and dispose of the pendant? The directness of the question seemed to startle Margaret momentarily. She set down her teacup with deliberate care before answering. I've been asking myself the same question since learning of her death, she said slowly, and I keep returning to one crucial point. Whoever killed Ava must have known not just about the pendant's value or its stolen origins, but about its function as a key, about what it could unlock, which narrows the field considerably, Claire noted. According to the evidence we've seen, only James knew about the safe deposit box and it contained. Unless he told someone else, Margaret suggested, someone he trusted with the family's deepest secrets. Are you implying he confided in a family member? Sean asked. Perhaps Fiona, given their apparently close relationship? Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral. I wouldn't presume to speculate on family confidences. I merely observe that James Kerrigan was a man who understood the importance of contingency planning. The idea that he would leave such significant information with no living person aware of it seems unlike him. The implication hung in the air that someone beyond James had known about the safe deposit box, the pendant's function, and potentially the documentation it protected. Someone who might have killed Ava when she got too close to discovering these secrets. There's one other possibility we haven't fully explored, Claire said after a moment. The pendant itself was thrown into Newcastle Harbor around 5 a.m. the morning after Ava's death. Did you happen to see or hear anything unusual around that time? Margaret's expression remained composed, but Claire noticed a slight tension in her posture. As I mentioned, I take sleep medication. I wouldn't have been aware of activity outside during those hours. The harbor is visible from your upstairs windows, isn't it? Claire pressed, remembering the view from Margaret's cottage. Parts of it, yes, Margaret acknowledged, though not the specific area where I understand the pendant was recovered. Before Claire could pursue this line of questioning further, Sean's phone rang. Inspector Nolan, according to the screen. As Sean stepped aside to take the call, Margaret fixed Claire with a penetrating stare. You suspect me in some capacity, don't you? She asked directly. Despite my cooperation, despite the information I've shared. Claire met her gaze steadily. I think you know more than you're telling us. Whether that makes you a suspect or simply someone protecting others, or perhaps yourself, remains to be seen. To Claire's surprise, Margaret smiled faintly. A fair assessment. We all have our reasons for discretion, Mrs. Murphy, even those of us who claim to value truth above all. Sean returned before Claire could respond, his expression grave. That was Inspector Nolan, he said. There's been another development. The safe they found in the hidden chamber has been opened. And, Claire prompted when he hesitated, it contained detailed records of payments, not just James's anonymous restitution efforts, but what appear to be blackmail payments to multiple individuals over decades. Sean's gaze shifted to Margaret, including much larger sums to someone identified only as MR than you previously acknowledged. Margaret's composure didn't waver. Financial arrangements are often more complex than they initially appear, she said carefully. There's more, Sean continued. They also found correspondence suggesting Ava had discovered these payment records shortly before her death and had confronted the recipient about them. For the first time, real alarm showed in Margaret's expression. What exactly are you implying, Dr. Murphy? I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Byrne, Sean replied evenly. I'm relating what Inspector Nolan has just told me. According to the documentation they've found, Ava Kerrigan confronted you about the true nature and extent of your arrangement with James 3 days before her death, the same day you claim you last saw her alive. Claire watched Margaret carefully, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor, a tightening around the eyes, a slight elevation in her breathing rate. Not necessarily indicators of guilt, but certainly signs of increased stress. "I think," Margaret said after a measured pause, "that I should contact my solicitor before discussing this matter further." "That's your right," Sean acknowledged. "Inspector Nolan asked us to inform you that officers will be arriving shortly to formally request your presence at the station for additional questioning." Margaret rose with dignity, despite her evident concern. "Then I should prepare myself, if you'll excuse me." As she showed them to the door, her composure largely restored, Margaret paused with her hand on the latch. "One last thing, Mrs. Murphy. You asked earlier about seeing activity near the harbor in the early morning hours after Ava died. While I maintain that I was asleep during that time, my security cameras might have captured something useful. Perhaps you should mention that to Inspector Nolan." The parting comment, delivered with deliberate casualness that belied its significance, left Claire momentarily speechless. By the time she recovered enough to ask follow-up questions, Margaret had already closed the door firmly behind them. "That was unexpected," Claire said as they walked back to their car. "Why mention security cameras now, after denying she saw anything suspicious?" "Strategy," Sean suggested. "She knows the police will eventually request her security footage during their investigation. Better to appear cooperative by volunteering its existence than to have it demanded later, which might suggest she was hiding something." "But if her cameras did capture someone disposing of the pendant in the harbor," Claire began, "then she's known who killed Ava all along," Sean finished grimly, "and has been selectively sharing information to direct suspicion where she wants it focused." As they drove home, Claire's mind worked through the implications of this latest development. Margaret Byrne, their enigmatic neighbor who had helped expose the McKeever scandal months earlier, now appeared to be entangled in the Kerrigan family secrets in ways far more complex than initially suggested. Had she been blackmailing James Kerrigan for substantially more money than she'd admitted? Had Ava confronted her about these payments, perhaps threatening exposure? And most crucially, did Margaret Byrne's security cameras capture evidence of who had thrown the pendant into Newcastle Harbor in the pre-dawn hours after Ava's death? The answers to these questions might finally reveal who had killed Ava Kerrigan and why the sapphire pendant had truly been the key to everything. The ledger contained meticulous documentation of over 200 items, ranging from museum-quality old master paintings to rare books, jewelry, silver, porcelain, and smaller artworks. Each entry included the item's description, its original ownership, the circumstances of its acquisition by Archibald Kerrigan, and a coded reference to its current location within the hidden chambers. Most disturbing were the notes indicating the fate of many original owners. Deported to Dachau 1941, presumed deceased Auschwitz 1943, fled to Switzerland, current whereabouts unknown. The clinical documentation of human tragedy alongside art cataloging created a chilling juxtaposition. "He knew," Catherine said quietly after reading several pages. "Grandfather knew exactly what was happening to these families when he took their possessions." "Yes," Margaret agreed grimly, "and he profited from their suffering, using these acquisitions to build the Kerrigan shipping empire into what it became after the war." Robert had grown increasingly pale as they reviewed the ledger. "The family trust," he said suddenly. "The foundation, our charitable giving. It's all tainted money." "Yes," Margaret acknowledged, "which is why James established anonymous restitution programs. He couldn't undo the original crimes, but he tried to direct Kerrigan resources toward Holocaust education, memorial efforts, and support for survivors." Claire thought of the multiple Kerrigan-funded initiatives in Newcastle, the library wing, hospital equipment, arts programs, all presented as generous philanthropy while concealing a much darker motivation. "But he kept the most valuable items hidden," Sean pointed out, "rather than returning them to their rightful owners or their descendants." James believed that immediate, complete restitution would raise too many questions, Margaret explained, referencing her husband's letter, about the source of the items, about how the Kerrigans acquired them. He feared that exposing Archibald's activities would destroy not just the family, but potentially implicate others who had been involved. Others? Claire asked. Who else knew about these acquisitions? Before Margaret could answer, Inspector Nolan returned with Fiona Kerrigan beside him. Fiona appeared composed but wary, her elegant demeanor somewhat diminished by the dust on her expensive clothing and the strain evident around her eyes. Mother, she acknowledged, then nodded to her siblings. I see you've discovered Father's documentation project. Is that what you call it? Catherine replied, a hint of accusation in her tone. We've been worried sick looking for you, while you've been hidden down here doing what exactly? Fiona's expression hardened slightly. Continuing Father's work, documenting each item for eventual restitution, researching surviving family members, preparing the way for these objects to finally go home. And you've been doing this since when? Robert demanded. Since Father became ill, Fiona replied calmly. He knew he was dying and asked me to continue what he'd started. I've been making regular trips back from Paris for years, documenting items and updating his research on original owners. Nolan, who had been listening to this exchange with professional interest, now interjected. Miss Kerrigan has shown me the dark room where she's been photographing items from the collection. It appears to be a long-term, systematic project. Did Ava know about this? Margaret asked directly, watching her daughter's face carefully. A flicker of emotion, grief perhaps, or guilt, crossed Fiona's composed features. Yes, she admitted. About 3 months ago, she followed me down here. I should have been more careful, but I never expected anyone to notice the cellar entrance being used. And you told her everything? Catherine pressed. I had to, Fiona replied. She'd already seen too much to be fobbed off with a partial truth. So yes, I explained about grandfather's acquisitions, about father's documentation project, about my role in continuing it. How did she react? Claire asked, interested in understanding Ava's state of mind in the weeks before her death. Fiona's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sadness. Initially, she was horrified, then fascinated, then determined to help. Ava had been searching for purpose, for something meaningful to do with her life. She saw this as her opportunity to contribute to righting a historical wrong. So she became your assistant, Margaret concluded. Yes, Fiona confirmed. She had a good eye for detail and a surprisingly methodical approach when properly motivated. We worked well together. Nolan, who had been making notes during this conversation, looked up with renewed focus. If Ava was involved in documenting these items, was she also aware of their value? Of what the collection as a whole might be worth? Fiona nodded slowly. She calculated it herself, actually. Approximately £100 million, based on current auction values for comparable works. The figure hung in the air, its magnitude emphasizing the scale of what Archibald Kerrigan had stolen and what the family had concealed for generations. And did she understand the implications? Nolan continued. For the family's finances, for its public standing, if this collection were returned or its origins revealed? Of course, Fiona replied. She wasn't naive, Inspector. Ava understood perfectly that revealing the truth would mean significant financial consequences for all of us. The foundation might survive, but the family's personal wealth would be dramatically reduced. Which gives everyone in this room a motive for silencing her if she threatened to expose the collection, Nolan observed neutrally, though his gaze swept across the assembled Kerrigans with professional assessment. Ava wasn't planning to expose anything, Fiona said firmly. She had embraced Father's approach, systematic, private restitution over time without public scandal. Then why was she killed? Robert demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. If not to silence her about all of this? Fiona turned to her brother, genuine anguish breaking through her composed exterior. I don't know, Robert. I've been asking myself the same question since I heard about her death. The last time I spoke with her was 2 weeks ago, before I returned to Paris for an exhibition opening. She seemed excited about a new lead she'd discovered regarding one of the paintings, a potential surviving family member living in Argentina. When exactly did you return from Paris? Nolan asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the obvious investigative importance of the question. Yesterday morning, Fiona replied without hesitation. I took the first available flight after Catherine called with the news about Ava. I can provide my boarding pass and passport stamps if needed. Claire noticed that while Fiona had answered the timing question directly, she hadn't addressed the implied question about her potential involvement in Ava's death. A skilled evasion that might be habit for someone accustomed to keeping family secrets, or might indicate something more sinister. That won't be necessary for the moment, Nolan said, making another note. But I would like you to provide a formal statement about your activities with Ava regarding this collection, particularly any conversations you had in the weeks before her death. Of course, Fiona agreed readily. Anything that might help identify who killed her. Walk us through the last few weeks from your perspective, Nolan continued. His tone conversational, but his attention wholly focused on Fiona's responses. When did you last see Ava alive, and what was her state of mind? Fiona considered the question carefully before answering. I saw her 3 weeks ago. We spent several days working together down here, documenting a newly discovered cache of silver items that Father had stored separately from the main collection. Ava was, energized by the work, more focused than I'd seen her in years. Did she mention any concerns? Any conflicts with family members or others who might have known about the collection? Not specifically, Fiona replied, though she did mention feeling watched occasionally. She thought one of you might have noticed her repeated visits to the estate. She glanced at Catherine and Robert. She was particularly concerned about Mother discovering her activities before we were ready to present a complete restitution plan. Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though Claire detected a flicker of pain at the suggestion that Ava had feared her reaction. Was anyone else aware of what you and Ava were doing? Nolan pressed. Staff members, friends, associates outside the family? For the first time, Fiona hesitated, a barely perceptible pause before she answered. Not to my knowledge. We were extremely discreet. But not discreet enough to prevent Ava from being followed, apparently, Sean observed quietly, if she felt she was being watched. Fiona's gaze shifted to him, assessing and wary. Perhaps not, though Ava could be paranoid at times, especially when under stress. One more question for now, Nolan said, his tone indicating they were approaching a critical point. The sapphire pendant, was it part of this collection? Another item looted during the Holocaust? Fiona's expression revealed genuine surprise at the question. The pendant? No, absolutely not. It's been in the family legitimately since 1913, commissioned for my grandmother from a jeweler in Vienna. Claire exchanged a quick glance with Sean, both noting that Fiona's version contradicted both Margaret Burns' account and the documentation from James's safe deposit box. You seem very certain of that, Nolan observed. Because Father showed me the original commission documents, Fiona replied confidently. The sapphire itself came from Kashmir, imported legally through the family's shipping connections. The setting was custom designed by Joseph Hoffmann, a prominent Viennese designer of the period. There's nothing questionable about its provenance. Margaret's slight intake of breath was almost inaudible, but Claire caught it. A reaction to hearing her daughter repeat the family fiction so convincingly that she clearly believed it herself. I see, Nolan said, making another note. And did Ava share your certainty about the pendant's origins? A shadow crossed Fiona's face. Actually, no. She'd become fixated on the pendant recently, asking questions about its history, examining it whenever Mother wore it. I assumed it was her artistic interest in fine jewelry, but looking back, she may have discovered something about it that contradicted the family narrative, Claire suggested. Possibly, Fiona conceded. Though what that might be, I can't imagine. The pendant's history is well documented. Or well fabricated, Claire thought, but didn't say. Aloud, she asked, Did Ava ever mention the name Margaret Byrne to you? Fiona's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of posture. Our neighbor? Yes, she mentioned visiting her several times. I didn't think much of it. Ava was always seeking connections with interesting people, and Mrs. Burns certainly qualifies as that. Did Ava tell you what they discussed? Sean pressed. Newcastle history, I believe, Fiona replied smoothly. Mrs. Byrne has lived here for decades and has quite the memory for local events and people, including, Claire thought, the arrival of a mysterious sapphire pendant on Margaret Kerrigan's neck in 1948, completely contradicting the story of it being a family heirloom since 1913. Well, Nolan said, closing his notebook, this has been informative. Mrs. Kerrigan, I need to secure these chambers as part of our investigation. My officers will be cataloging the contents and comparing them against the ledger documentation. Of course, Inspector, Margaret agreed. Whatever you need. I'd also like formal statements from each of you, Nolan continued, regarding your knowledge of this collection, your interactions with Ava in the weeks before her death, and your whereabouts during the critical period between midnight and 3 a.m. on the night she died. The request, standard procedure in a murder investigation, nevertheless fell heavily on the assembled family members. They were no longer simply grieving relatives but potential suspects, each required to account for their movements during the hours when Ava Kerrigan had died. We'll cooperate fully, Margaret assured him, speaking for the family with the authority she'd always wielded. As they prepared to leave the hidden chambers, Claire noticed something on the desk that had been partially obscured by the ledger, a small notebook with a distinctive purple cover. Something about it triggered a memory, though she couldn't immediately place it. Inspector, she called, pointing to the notebook. That might be relevant. Nolan carefully lifted the notebook, opening it to reveal pages of handwritten notes in a youthful, somewhat erratic script. This appears to be Miss Kerrigan's personal notes about the collection, he observed, scanning the contents. There are references to specific paintings, research notes about surviving family members, and, he paused, turning to a page marked with a colored tab, and notes about the sapphire pendant. Margaret stepped forward. What does it say? Nolan read aloud, Pendant contradictions, grandmother's story versus MB's account. Need to verify London theft 1913? Check museum archives for similar pieces from Vienna seizures. Key to what? A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications of Ava's notes became clear. She had indeed been investigating the pendant's origins, comparing Margaret Kerrigan's version with information presumably provided by Margaret Byrne. And most significantly, she had somehow learned of the pendant's function as a key. She knew, Catherine said softly, about the safe deposit box, about whatever father had hidden there, which makes the timing of her death and the pendant's disappearance far too coincidental, Sean concluded grimly. Nolan carefully placed the notebook in an evidence bag, his expression thoughtful. It seems we're beginning to understand why Miss Kerrigan was killed. The question remains, by whom? As they filed out of the hidden chambers, returning to the main house via the wine cellar stairs, Claire found herself walking beside Fiona. You didn't seem surprised by Nolan reading from Ava's notebook, Claire observed quietly, about her investigating the pendant. Fiona glanced at her with cool assessment. Because I wasn't. I knew Ava was fixated on the pendant, though I didn't know she'd connected it to a key or a safe deposit box. And you weren't concerned about her questioning the family narrative, potentially exposing more secrets? Mrs. Murphy, Fiona replied with unexpected directness. My entire adult life has been shaped by questioning family narratives and exposing secrets. Why would I fear Ava doing the same? The question was reasonable, yet something in Fiona's tone struck Claire as performative. A carefully crafted response designed to project openness while revealing nothing. Perhaps, Claire suggested, because some secrets are more dangerous than others. Looted art can be returned, reputations damaged but rebuilt. But if Ava discovered something that couldn't be so neatly resolved? Fiona's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened slightly. You're very perceptive, Mrs. Murphy, and very involved in my family's affairs for someone who moved to Newcastle only a few months ago. Your mother invited our involvement, Claire reminded her. Perhaps because sometimes an outside perspective sees what those closest to a situation cannot. And what do you see? Fiona asked, her tone a blend of curiosity and challenge. Claire met her gaze directly. I see a family built on secrets and silence. I see generations of deception justified as protection. And I see Ava, young, impulsive, truth-seeking Ava, as a threat to that carefully maintained system. An interesting assessment, Fiona acknowledged, neither confirming nor denying Claire's observations, though perhaps incomplete. Before Claire could press further, they reached the main floor of the house, where police activity had intensified during their time in the tunnels. Officers moved throughout the ground floor, some taking photographs, others interviewing staff members. The discovery of hidden chambers filled with looted art had clearly elevated the investigation to a new level of seriousness. As the group dispersed, Nolan to coordinate with his team, Margaret to speak with Mr. Winters, Catherine and Robert to prepare for formal interviews, Sean drew Claire aside into a quiet alcove. "What did Fiona say to you?" he asked in a low voice. Claire summarized their brief exchange, adding, "There's something she's not telling us, something beyond the art collection and the pendant." "I agree," Sean replied, "and I think Margaret knows what it is. Did you notice how she's been watching Fiona since we found her in the dark room? Not with surprise or suspicion, but with something closer to recognition." Claire had indeed noticed the unusual dynamic between mother and daughter, a tension that went beyond the general family strain of the situation. "We need to speak with Margaret Byrne again," Claire decided. She clearly knows more about the pendant's history than she initially shared, and if Ava was consulting her about it, she might know what Ava discovered that got her killed, Sean finished. "But we should be careful. If Margaret Byrne has been keeping Kerrigan's secrets for decades, she has her own stake in how this plays out." Claire nodded agreement, then hesitated as a new thought occurred to her. "The purple notebook," she said suddenly. "I just remembered where I've seen it before." "Where?" "In Ava's hand, the night we drove her home from Thornfield. She was clutching a small purple notebook when she got into our car." Claire frowned, trying to recall the details of that rainy night. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but it's the same notebook Nolan just found in the hidden chamber," Sean concluded. "Which means Ava must have returned to Thornfield after we dropped her at her apartment. Or someone brought the notebook back here after her death," Claire suggested grimly. The implication hung between them, that whoever had killed Ava might have also taken her notebook, recognizing its importance as evidence and hidden it among the very secrets she had been investigating. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Nolan approaching with purposeful strides. "Dr. and Mrs. Murphy," he acknowledged. "I wonder if I might have a word? In private." His tone suggested this wasn't a casual request. Claire and Sean exchanged glances before following Nolan to a small sitting room that had been temporarily appropriated as an interview space. "Please, sit," Nolan invited, closing the door behind them. "I find myself in a somewhat delicate position, and I could use your perspective." "How can we help, Inspector?" Sean asked as they settled into chairs opposite Nolan. "You've been present for most of the key discoveries in this case," Nolan began. "The missing pendant, the safe deposit box, now the hidden chambers beneath Thornfield. You've observed the Kerrigan family dynamics with relatively unbiased eyes." "I'm not sure any observer can be truly unbiased," Claire noted. "But we've tried to remain objective, yes." Nolan nodded, accepting the qualification. "Based on everything you've seen and heard, I'd like your assessment. Who had the strongest motive to kill Ava Kerrigan and dispose of the pendant?" The directness of the question took Claire by surprise. She glanced at Sean, who appeared equally taken aback by Nolan's willingness to consult them so openly. "You understand we're not detectives," Sean said carefully. "Any observations we might offer would be amateur at best." "Sometimes an outside perspective can be invaluable," Nolan replied, echoing Claire's earlier words to Fiona. "And you both have demonstrated observational skills and analytical thinking throughout this investigation." After a moment's consideration, Claire decided to offer her honest assessment. "Each family member had potential motives," she began. "Catherine stood to inherit the pendant as the eldest daughter, following family tradition, a tradition Ava would have disrupted if Margaret's will leaving it to her had been enacted. Robert had financial entanglements with Ava that might have become problematic if exposed," Sean added, "and was facing the collapse of the family business, which restitution of the looted art would have accelerated. Fiona was directly involved with Ava in documenting the collection," Claire continued. If Ava discovered something about the pendant that contradicted what Fiona believed or claimed to believe about its origins. And Margaret herself, Nolan prompted when they hesitated, had perhaps the strongest motive of all, Claire acknowledged reluctantly. If Ava threatened to expose the pendant's true origins and the safe deposit box it unlocked, she would have been challenging the foundation of Margaret's entire life, her marriage, her family legacy, her social position. Yet Margaret is the one who called you to Thornfield when the pendant went missing, Nolan observed, who has consistently pushed for transparency about family secrets since Ava's death, which could be genuine grief and desire for justice, Sean suggested, or a calculated strategy to appear cooperative while controlling the narrative. Nolan made a note in his book, his expression thoughtful. And what about individuals outside the immediate family? Margaret Byrne, for instance, who had a long-standing financial arrangement with James Kerrigan regarding the pendant. Claire considered this possibility. Mrs. Byrne certainly had knowledge about the pendant that might have made her dangerous to the family if she decided to stop accepting payments and go public with what she knew. But why kill Ava? Sean countered. If Mrs. Byrne wanted leverage over the Kerrigans, Ava was potentially an ally, not a threat. Unless, Claire suggested slowly, Ava discovered something about Margaret Byrne's involvement that went beyond simple blackmail, something that implicated her more directly in the family's secrets. Nolan nodded, making another note. I'll be interviewing Mrs. Byrne formally tomorrow. Her long-standing connection to the Kerrigans and her acknowledged role in blackmailing James Kerrigan make her a person of interest, at minimum. There's one other possibility, Claire said, thinking of Fiona's cryptic warning about not all players being present. Catherine mentioned her late husband, David, was also blackmailing James about the family secrets. If he shared that information with someone else before his death, a partner or associate, that person might have continued the arrangement, and might have seen Ava as a threat if she was investigating the pendant and its connection to family secrets, Nolan concluded. A promising angle to explore. As Nolan made further notes, Claire found herself reflecting on the tangled web of Kerrigan family secrets, layers upon layers of deception spanning generations. What had begun as a missing pendant had revealed Nazi-looted art, blackmail schemes, hidden chambers, and ultimately murder. There's one thing we haven't fully addressed, Sean said after a moment. The pendant itself was thrown into Newcastle harbor around 5 a.m. the morning after Ava's death. Who would have had both the pendant and the motive to dispose of it at that specific time? Someone who knew what it unlocked, Claire replied. Someone who knew about James's safe deposit box and wanted to ensure its contents remained inaccessible. Or someone who discovered Ava was dead and panicked, Nolan suggested, disposing of the pendant to eliminate evidence linking them to both the theft and potentially the murder. The three possibilities hung in the air between them: calculated disposal to protect secrets, panicked reaction to eliminate evidence, or perhaps some combination of both. Whatever the motivation, the timing connected the pendant directly to Ava's death in a way that couldn't be dismissed as coincidental. I appreciate your insights, Nolan said, closing his notebook, and your discretion. As this investigation progresses, I may call on you again for your perspectives. As they left the sitting room, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that despite all they had discovered, they were still missing something crucial about Ava's death and the pendant's significance. The key pieces were there, but the pattern they formed remained elusive. And somewhere in Thornfield Hall, she suspected, was someone who knew exactly how those pieces fit together and was watching carefully to ensure the full picture never emerged.